In the last video, we looked at chapters 17 and 18 of Jehoshaphat's reign. Chapter 17 dealt primarily with Jehoshaphat's reformation projects. Chapter 18 was the ill-advised alliance with Ahab, where he follows the rebel king of the north into battle, and it's a disastrous one. Chapters 19 and 20 are going to follow a similar pattern, with chapter 19 being the return to Jehoshaphat's reformation projects, and chapter 20 being another war, except this time Jehoshaphat is going to respond positively. And in fact, it's going to be a very positive response, and it's going to bring a number of themes that we've seen in Chronicles up to this point together. And so because it's such an important chapter, we're going to spend the majority of our time there. So we're going to speed run chapter 19. And chapter 19 begins, verse 1, Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, returned in safety to his house in Jerusalem. And as you may recall, that language of returning in safety, specifically, literally, it's peace. And that goes back to Micaiah's prophecy about who would return in peace and safety. And of course, Micaiah was vindicated in his prophecy, and Jehoshaphat, who cried out to the Lord, is returning in peace back to Jerusalem. Verse 2, but Jehu, the son of Hanani, the seer, went out to meet him and said to King Jehoshaphat, should you help the wicked and love those who hate the Lord? Concerning this love language, we have a scholar here, William Moran, pointed out love can refer to the relationship between treaty partners. Jehoshaphat joining Ahab in a joint marriage alliance or military adventure could be described as love. And concerning the hate, the who in this verse here is obviously Ahab. And he hates the Lord. And we know that because he specifically tells us that he hates Micaiah, because he always prophesies disaster for him. But that's because Ahab is an apostate. And so Ahab hates the words of the Lord coming to him by way of Micaiah. So we know that Ahab hates the Lord. And so Jehoshaphat has no business allying with those who hate the Lord. And continuing with Jehu, he says, because of this, wrath has gone out against you from the Lord. Nevertheless, some good is found in you, for you destroyed the Asheroth out of the land and have set your heart to seek God. Of course, the seek language is one of our key terms in Chronicles. And at the very end of this video, I want to return to this wrath language, that the wrath has gone out against you from the Lord. And then moving down to verse 4, Jehoshaphat lived at Jerusalem, and probably more literally should be dwelt or reigned even in Jerusalem. And this is actually the end of a paragraph break. And then this is the beginning of a new section. And he went out again, and this is where he's going to begin to appoint judges and the Levites and teachers and that kind of thing. I do want to note verse 6. And Lightheart notes here how symmetrical this verse is. And we've seen a verse kind of like this earlier in Chronicles. And so this is going to be kind of clunky, but as you can see the symmetry, I'm just going to read this down because you have to read it very literally to see how symmetrical it is. So it reads, to the judges, see what you do, for not for man you judge, but for Yahweh, and with you he is in the word of judgment. It sounds kind of like Yoda, but you're getting the judging elements mixed in with, especially in C and C prime. It's not for man you judge, but for Yahweh. Of course, you only really get that if you translate it very literally, as he does here in this section. And Lightheart also notes this, that is kind of interesting, that both exhortations use the verb asa, to make or do. So there's creation resonances with what Jehoshaphat is tasking them with. And he continues down here, misjudgment incurs asham, guilt, which provokes Yahweh's wrath. By doing their mishpat, judges maintain the new creation order that is Judah. But I do want to pick up on this note here by, I think this is Dillard in his commentary, because in previous eras, older commentators like Wellhausen basically thought this was more or less a literary invention modeled after the time of the chronicler, so this post-exilic period. But what he and other commentators like Albright note is that you do have this kind of thing. You have parallels in history, especially like Egyptian history here in the 14th century. So roughly 500 years before Jehoshaphat, you have this kind of thing where you have an Egyptian king in both texts describe a king's tour of the country, the appointment of judges in the large towns, royal exhortations concerning bribery and extortion, and cultic officials with judicial roles. And he further says it's not necessary to suggest any direct dependence on that decree for Jehoshaphat's reform. So in other words, it's not based off of that, but we do have precedents of this kind of thing happening in the ancient world, even before the time of Jehoshaphat. So it's not necessary to say that this is the chronicler injecting his current time period back to the chroniclers. This kind of thing would have been known at that time. And I want to pick up down here that wrath may not come upon you and your brothers. Of course, this wrath language takes us back to the warning of the prophet. But I want to pick up with this note from Lightheart. He says, in the exhortation to the judges of Jerusalem, the king brings out another facet of their work. Judges warn their brothers, a term that suggests a pedagogical or prophetic dimension to the work of a judge. Perhaps the judges are expected to instruct Judah in Torah, as the teachers had done earlier. But it appears that a mishpat is itself a warning. When judges judge with and for and in the dread of Yahweh, their judicial decisions encourage certain paths of action and discourage others. Law needs to be taught, but law itself teaches. Law opens and closes possibilities of behavior. It cannot be morally neutral. The fact that litigants are described as brothers suggests a familial dimension to their work. Judges are not a separated class, but are charged with maintaining order in the family of Judah. But I thought this was interesting because this is almost completely antithetical to what we currently have in like our Western judicial systems, this whole idea. But I thought I'd read that out for you so you can meditate on that. And then this last line in chapter 19 is interesting. Deal courageously, and may the Lord be with the upright. And literally, upright is good. Of course, this brings back to mind some of the earlier language. And deal courageously, as it's translated here. This is a common refrain we've seen in Chronicles, as John Stone's going to pick up on. He says, Jehoshaphat concludes with an exhortation and a prayer. Be strong. That's the way he translates that phrase. Matches the calling of the king as successor to David, as originally the community had rallied to David. May the Lord be with the good reflects the Jerusalem theology of Emmanuel, God with us. Good forms a fitting climax to the reform. It equally echoes sacramental theology. It is in the practice of the revealed goodness of God that the community realizes its own nature and destiny as good. And now moving down to chapter 20, where we're going to have another of these military engagements. And specifically, Dillard picks up on the fact that we have here a holy war narrative. So we have typical contours of that. Battle oracles Israel's army in the role of spectators, while Yahweh fights for them music, self-destruction, and obliteration of the enemy. And he says, compare Deuteronomy 7 and Deuteronomy 20. In that vein, I want to look at Lightheart. He writes, though 2 Chronicles 20 is one of the clearest biblical examples of liturgical warfare, it is by no means the only one. Israel commonly wins victories by calling on the Lord in prayer and exalting him in praise. Yahweh began his war against Egypt in response to the cries of Israel. At Jericho, Israel won by processing around the city with the Ark of the Covenant, blowing trumpets and shouting. Samuel led Israel to victory at the Battle of Ebenezer by offering sacrifices and crying out to the Lord. In the New Testament, Revelation describes a progress of heavenly liturgy. The book is opened, the trumpets proclaim the word of God, and the angels pour out blood from sacramental bowls. As the heavenly worship progresses, the Lord pours out his judgment on the great city. The liturgy's power does not lie in the liturgy itself. There is nothing automatic or magical about a worship service. Liturgical warfare is effective only as it expresses the worshiper's reliance on the Lord of hosts, the God of battles. When he is exalted in our praises, he becomes a terror to our enemies, leaves the field strewn with corpses, and makes the valley of battle into a valley of Beracah, which means blessing. Of course, we'll get to that further down in this narrative. So verse 1 reads, "After this, the Moabites and Ammonites, and with them some of the Meunites, came against Jehoshaphat for battle." Now, there's a lot of controversy about this verse, namely the third group here, because literally, if I click on it, it's actually Ammonites again. But of course, that doesn't make sense. The Moabites and Ammonites with some of the Ammonites. And so the Greek actually reads this, and so many people follow the Greek in this particular case. And part of the confusion with that is this issue as well. As you can see, it's Edom here in English, but if you look down there, it's Aram. And the difference between those two words is in an R or a D, which look virtually the same in Hebrew. So you will have one manuscript, at least, Hebrew manuscript, that says Edom, but most of them actually say Aram. And so there's a lot of debate about that, but who cares really, because it's tough to know exactly. But moving down to verse 2, "Some men came and told Jehoshaphat, 'A great multitude is coming against you from Edom,'" or Aram, who knows, "from beyond the sea, and behold, they are in Hazazon Tamar," that is, in Gedi. And we've seen this great multitude language before, great horde. As Dillard points out, the attacking armies are described as, here, great multitude, he describes it, or he translates it, a vast horde, a favorite way in which the chronicler designates a numerically superior enemy in other battle narratives showing holy war themes. So this is just another piece of evidence that we are dealing with holy war typology here. And we'll pick up on this note from Lightheart concerning this language here. He says, "David subdued the Moabites and Ammonites, making them tributary states of Israel," in chapter 18 of 1 Chronicles. "Ahab lost control of the Moabites, and since Jehoshaphat is allied with Ahab, he becomes a target for the Moabite backlash." Of course, remember, he should not have allied with Ahab, but the problem gets even deeper. In some Hebrew texts, these nations are accompanied by Arameans. If that is accurate, it is a further ironic twist. Jehoshaphat's father, Asa, paid the Arameans to attack Baasha's Israel, and now, fortified with gold from the temple and Judah's royal treasury, they turn back to attack Judah. The entire crisis is the result of Jehoshaphat's alliance with the northern kingdom. And of course, I would also extend and say the fact that his father paid this group money to attack Israel, who now his son is allied with. But in doing so, he empowered these people. In Western geopolitics, this kind of thing happens all the time, where we've empowered certain groups and then, of course, end up fighting them with our own weapons, and it's a mess. But it's not anything new. It's been going on since the ancient times. But continuing with Lightheart, he says, "The nations come from beyond the sea that represents the chaos of the Gentile world, the sea from which monsters come. These nations are the sea, a foaming flood threatening to overwhelm Judah." And it's facing this that we get to verse 3. "Then Jehoshaphat was afraid and set his face to seek the Lord, and he proclaimed a fast throughout all Judah. And Judah assembled to seek help from the Lord. From all the cities of Judah they came to seek the Lord." And of course, this seeking language is important. It's what kings should do. And the proclaiming of a fast is interesting. Johnstone picks up on this. And he points out that the only other time a fast is observed in Chronicles is, suggestively enough, on the occasion of the death of Saul. The present observance of humiliation before God by the submissive king before the encounter with the enemy contrasts directly with the lament for the death of the defiant king, who would not refer matters to God after the disastrous defeat into which he has led his people. So his point being that this was what Saul failed to do, to seek the Lord, and because of that led to disaster and his own death, a death that was observed by a fast. Well, now Jehoshaphat seeks the Lord and proactively proclaims a fast. And of course, they're going to be miraculously delivered. Down to verse 5, "And Jehoshaphat stood in the assembly of Judah and Jerusalem and the house of the Lord before the new court, and said, 'O Lord God of our fathers, are you not God in heaven? You rule over all the kingdoms of the nations. In your hand are power and might, so that none is able to withstand you. Did you not, our God, drive out the inhabitants of this land before your people Israel, and give it forever to the descendants of Abraham your friend? And they have lived in it, and have built for you in it a sanctuary for your name, saying, if disaster comes upon us, the sword, judgment, or pestilence, or famine, we will stand before this house and before you, for your name is in this house, and cry out to you in our affliction, and you will hear and save. Of course, this is quoting Solomon's prayer. And now behold the men of Ammon and Moab and Mount Seir, whom you would not let Israel invade when they came from the land of Egypt, and whom they avoided and did not destroy. Behold, they reward us by coming to drive us out of your possession, which you have given us to inherit. O our God, will you not execute judgment on them? For we are powerless against this great horde that is coming against us. We did not know what to do, but our eyes are on you. A lot of interesting things going on in this prayer. It should be noted here that this is kahal, ecclesia, that kind of idea. And moving down, this language of they have lived in, or I think it's literally dwelt. It's the same language, I think, of the inhabitants. And in fact, it goes all the way up to Jehoshaphat reigning in Jerusalem. But Johnstone has a good comment on this. He says, they have taken up residence because God has at once dispossessed the pre-Israelite population and granted possession to Israel in his inheritance. To take up residence is the same word as is used of Jehoshaphat's taking up rule in Jerusalem, and is used for the same sacramental reason. As the king can only take up rule because he occupies the Lord's throne, so Israel can only take up their inheritance because it is the Lord's inheritance. I find this very interesting because that is the primary interest in this particular passage. And in fact, Jehoshaphat is going to refer to this further down. The fact that the nations that were given to Israel in the Promised Land, they were not given arbitrarily. And this brings me back to, I think it was in a Q&A with Heiser, where somebody was asking him about this. What's so special about the land? Couldn't God have given them Egypt or some better land even? And he argued that it's very complex, but he thinks it essentially goes back to Nephilim, Genesis 6 kind of stuff, giant clan populations and things like that, that was part of the previous inhabitants that were being dispossessed of the land. And part of this is why they were not supposed to attack certain of these groups, because God had not given them over to them. In fact, some of these previous descendants had actually been fighting the previous giant clan populations as well. And so they were told to just march past them, not to harass them, not to try to take their land. But Jehoshaphat is pointing out here, they reward us by coming to drive us out of your possession, which you have given us to inherit. And in fact, even this language of coming to drive us out, could be legitimately translated as invaded. They're invading us to drive us out of your possession. And in that similar vein, this was from that dissertation by Mingyam Ko that I quoted a couple times in First Chronicles. But here he's actually pointing out some interesting stuff because he's connecting this idea to Deuteronomy 32:8, that God's people were the Lord's portion. And so you have the Most High God, Yahweh, dividing up the nations according to the number of the sons of God, or of the gods. That is a legitimate translation. In other words, the nations were put under the control of lesser divine beings, the lowercase g gods, if you will. And so this coalition of armies coming against Israel into the Lord's portion, into the Lord's allotted people and location, it's an affront to the high God himself. And this is really what Jehoshaphat is actually appealing to, because he actually notes this. They are coming, they are invading to drive us out of your possession. So he's not taking ownership of the land. He's saying, no, this land is yours that you've given to us. And they're trying to kick us out of your land. And so this is an attack on the Lord. And he's basically saying, will you not execute judgment on them? Of course, this is especially interesting because, as Johnstone's going to point out, that is the basis of Jehoshaphat's name. His name means the Lord has judged. And as Johnstone says, he puts all the onus on God, not in blame, but for action. It is not Israel's inheritance that is under threat, but God's own inheritance, which he has bestowed upon Israel. And so I absolutely agree with the commentators here that this is indeed what's going on here. But I think a deeper dimension that the dissertation I alluded to a moment ago, as well as Heiser's work, adds that second layer to these stories when you're dealing with the heavenly host, which some of the nations were put under the control of. Of course, we met the heavenly host in the last chapter. They were part of the judgment against Ahab in deluding him and his prophets. And we're about to see them again here momentarily. So moving down to verse 13, meanwhile, all Judah stood before the Lord with their little ones, their wives, and their children. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jahaziel, the son of Zechariah, son of Benaiah, son of Jahaziel, son of Mattaniah, a Levite of the sons of Asaph, in the midst of the assembly. And he said, listen, all Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem, and King Jehoshaphat. And he's going to launch into this prophecy, which we'll take a look at. But first, let's take a look at him and some of the ideas that are floating around here. This is earlier in Han's commentary. He's pointing a connected link here. He says, if the chronicler believed that these singers were in charge of singing David's divinely inspired compositions, the Psalms, if their particular duty was the recitation of the Psalms in the liturgy, then their ministry indeed could be called prophetic. In singing the Psalms, they would be proclaiming the word of the Lord to the Kahal Ecclesia and meditating the divine presence expressed in the inspired word. And also, we get this mini biography here, and Dillard points out, the chronicler provides a linear genealogy for Jahaziel to a depth of at least 5 generations. This would bring his pedigree back to the time of David's organization of the temple personnel. Jahaziel is traced to the line of Asaph and would therefore be among the Levitical musicians. And that's why this is interesting, because he does not seem to be a typical prophet in the way we'd probably think of him. He was a musician, but of course this goes back to what I read from Han, that if they were singing the inspired words of David, then there was a sense in which the music they performed was prophetic. So he was a prophet in that sense. But here he kind of crosses over into the more traditional kind of prophet and is going to deliver this oracle. And it's also worth noting here that Dillard says that Jahaziel's speech also resembles quite closely the prescribed speech for a priest before battle. The salvation oracle and holy war forms appear melded in this speech. Holy war themes predominate. The numerical superiority of the foe, the passivity of Israel when the divine warrior fights on its behalf, the injunctions not to fear, and he says compare the exhortations of 1 Samuel 17:47, Exodus 14:13 and 14, Psalm 91, 7 and 8. And Johnstone has this, it's not really chiastic, but he has this pattern, this threefold pattern thrice repeated. And so basically it breaks down this way. You have the reassurance, the reason for confidence, and then an instruction. And then this time, there's no reassurance element there, but you do go back to the reason for confidence, and then instruction, and then it's going to repeat again. The reassurance, and then instruction. The reason for confidence. So that's basically the pattern of his prophecy he's going to give. But he says, thus says the Lord to you, do not be afraid and do not be dismayed at this great horde. For the battle is not yours, but God's. Tomorrow go down against them. Behold, they will come up the ascent of Ziz. You will find them at the end of the valley, east of the wilderness of Jeruel. You will not need to fight in this battle. Stand firm, hold your position, and see the salvation of the Lord on your behalf. O Judah and Jerusalem, do not be afraid and do not be dismayed. Tomorrow go out against them, and the Lord will be with you. And Lightheart, among others, is going to note the similarity that we have with the Exodus. He says it's reminiscent of Moses' words at the Red Sea, and we just noted earlier, Exodus 14:13. Do not be afraid, stand still. See the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. And Lightheart concludes, it is a new Exodus from an Egypt-like threat, complete with a plunder, which we'll get to momentarily. And concerning this wilderness valley, Jeruel, Klein here quotes Mackenzie, argues that Jeruel means God sees, and finds a pun with the roots see in verse 17 and with the root fear in verses 15 and 17. So perhaps a pun on that name. And then we'll move down to verse 18. The Jehoshaphat bowed his head with his face to the ground, and all Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem fell down before the Lord, worshiping the Lord. And the Levites of the Kohathites and the Korahites stood up to praise the Lord, the God of Israel, with a very loud voice. It should be noted this very loud here, once again, appears to be our pun on Ma'al. So as we can see, we're looking at this one, exceedingly great, here very. It's one of these. Of course, right above this is the other Ma'al, unfaithful, falsehood, trespass. But I want to pick up here with Dillard. He said, it must not be overlooked that the prophets the author is speaking of are the Levitical musicians. One had just delivered a salvation oracle, and the musical praise for the battle march, and even the night before, was itself prophesying. So the point he's making here is that the musicians, the music, all of this is itself part of prophecy. And in fact, we more or less, I think, should read this as something of a worship service that goes on through the night, because then the next verse, and they rose early in the morning. So this goes on through the night, then they wake up in the morning and went out into the wilderness of Tekoa. And when they went out, Jehoshaphat stood and said, hear me, Judah, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Believe in the Lord your God, and you will be established. Believe his prophets, and you will succeed. And when he had taken counsel with the people, he appointed those who were to sing to the Lord and praise him in holy attire, as they went before the army, and say, give thanks to the Lord, for his steadfast love endures forever. In Lightheart notes a quasi-chiastic structure to Jehoshaphat's speech. But I want to pick up with Johnstone. He says, his exhortation is based directly on the Jerusalem tradition. It is modeled on the words of Isaiah, precisely to Judah and Jerusalem, in Isaiah 7:9. If you will not believe, you will not be established. Of course, this is the opposite of that. It adds piquancy to Chronicles' sense of the unity of history, that he uses words recorded at the time of Ahaz, 6 reigns later than Jehoshaphat. In Jehoshaphat's address, coordinated imperatives and justives amount to conditional statements. If you place your security in the Lord your God, you will be secured. If you rely on his prophets, in this case a Levite and a king, you will succeed. Another of the chronicler's key terms. There is also an echo in these words of the narrative of the Exodus, significant in the light of the other references to the Exodus narrative in this story. There too, belief in God and in his human spokesman and agent are coordinated. And that's Exodus 14:31, which reads, thus Israel saw the great work which the Lord had done in Egypt. So the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses. And so quite a bit of Exodus themes going on here in this story. And then down to verse 22, and when they began to sing and praise, the Lord set an ambush against the men of Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir, who had come against Judah, so that they were routed. For the men of Ammon and Moab rose against the inhabitants of Mount Seir, devoting them to destruction. And that is the Haram language. And when they had made an end of the inhabitants of Seir, they all helped to destroy one another. There's a lot of interesting terminology in this little passage. And Dillard points out that the battle cry ordinarily heard is replaced by a choral. Yahweh set ambushes, literally those who lie in wait against the foe. And Dillard further points out that though the role of the musicians may be enlarged or enhanced in the eyes of a modern historian, one must not forget the role of music in warfare, ancient and modern. Armies through the millennia have gone into battle to musical cadence. Particularly within Israel's tradition of holy war, music has been assigned an important function. Music accompanies the appearance of the divine warrior to execute judgment. Yahweh marches at the head of the armies of heaven and Israel. His appearance on the day of Yahweh is marked by a trumpet blast. And here he's listing a number of passages that go into these themes. So this is a quite well-attested theme. And it should be noted, although I guess I didn't quote one of the commentaries, some commentators have tried over the years to soften the language of what happens here, insofar as they try to appeal to some kind of naturalistic explanation. This ambush that the Lord sets, that perhaps it was some elite mercenary force or something that was part of this ambush or whatever. But the text itself seems to imply that this was done directly by the Lord. So in a sense, this is the reversal of chapter 18, where the divine council declared disaster for Ahab and by extension his armies. Here, because of the proper response of Jehoshaphat, the divine council apparently is employed to cause confusion among the armies, and they rout each other. So there's divine intervention, and probably lending credibility to that also is, again, this helped language is kind of odd. I think I do have a note here that Johnstone is picking up on some of this language, again, routed, helped, destroy, that these are picking up with Exodus themes. So he says, Chronicles again uses the language of the Exodus. They are smitten and consign one another to the destroyer. Deliverance as of the Passover is reenacted. And here is referring obviously to the Passover, where the angel is going and destroying along the way, which itself connects to 1 Chronicles 21, where you have the angel of the Lord destroying Jerusalem, again in an anti-type Passover. And it is very interesting because we've had divine council kind of themes in all of these connecting passages as well, like Exodus. Exodus 12 tells us specifically that this is the Passover, right? And we have down here in verse 12, on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. And so I think this is just another one of these connecting ideas. And Klein writes, the battle in this verse indeed was God's and not Israel's, in clear distinction to the role of Abijah's army against North Israel and Asa's defeat of the Cushites. That this self-destruction resulted from divinely inspired panic may also be indicated by the unusual use of the verb helped. Of course, it's our term here. And so I agree that this is completely in concert with what we saw with Ahab in chapter 18 and the use of deception and delusion against the enemies of God. We see that theme again in this chapter. In picking up at verse 24, when Judah came to the watchtower of the wilderness, they looked toward the horde, and behold, there were dead bodies lying on the ground. None had escaped. When Jehoshaphat and his people came to take their spoil, they found among them in great numbers goods, clothing, and precious things, which they took for themselves until they could carry no more. They were 3 days in taking the spoil. It was so much. And here Johnstone says that this, again, cross-references to the Exodus narrative. He says, Jehoshaphat and his people get the spoils for themselves, just as the Israelites departing from Egypt spoiled the Egyptians. It is only in this passage, and Exodus 3:22 and 12:36, that this word is found in this form with this meaning. The 3 days it took them to strip the corpses is a conventional expression of completeness. But this really links these passages solidly together. The fact that these are the only passages that use this language in this way. And picking up verse 26, on the 4th day they assembled in the valley of Beracah, for there they blessed the Lord. Therefore the name of that place has been called the Valley of Beracah to this day. And this is a very interesting connection, again, by Johnstone. He says, the victory is celebrated with a commemorative name-giving ceremony at a sacral assembly at the site of the battle. It is forever thereafter known as Beracah, blessing, a place name not in fact found elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, whereas in the curse narrative of the original settlement in Judges 2:1-5, rebellious Israel entered the land at a similar location, which they named Bochim, weepers. Here, Israel, having conducted themselves in an entirely obedient manner, enjoy the full blessing of God. And this I find very interesting, because in Judges 2, we read an interesting detail that probably escapes us unless we've really studied this stuff out. It's one of those things you may have read this passage but not really realized what's going on. But chapter 2 begins with, now the angel of the Lord went from Gilgal to Bochim. And he said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I swore to give to your fathers, and is going to continue on and charge them with not keeping up their end of the covenant. But what's interesting is apparently they had some visible form of embodied presence going along with them from the Exodus in Egypt up to this point. And he says, so now I say, I will not drive them out before you. So he's not going to do the 2 Chronicles 20 thing for them. But they shall become thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you. And as soon as the angel spoke the words, the people wept and lifted up their voices, and they called that place Bochim, which means weeping or weepers. But it's just very interesting because it really does form a nice juxtaposition between these two narratives. But returning back to Chronicles, they came to Jerusalem with harps and lyres and trumpets to the house of the Lord. And the fear of God came on all the kingdoms of the countries when they heard that the Lord had fought against the enemies of Israel. And again, that's Exodus type language. And so I'm pointing out here that in verse 20, Jehoshaphat calls on Judah and Jerusalem to hear. The kingdoms of the nations hear that the Lord had fought against the enemies of Israel. And Lightheart writes, Moab and Ammon came to plunder Judah, but the plunderers end up plundered. The battle of the valley of Beracah reverberates throughout the remainder of Jehoshaphat's reign, just as the Canaanites in Joshua's day were fearful of Israel because of the rumors they heard coming up from Egypt. So this new exodus terrorizes surrounding nations. They leave Jehoshaphat alone, and his kingdom returns to peace. He's referring here to verse 30, so the realm of Jehoshaphat was quiet, for his God gave him rest all around. And rest here it's actually the term that's related to Noah's name. Then Jehoshaphat reigned over Judah. He was 35 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 25 years in Jerusalem. And it's going to give the rest of his biographical details. It is worth noting here that, as Dillard points out here, Chronicles reports a reign of 25 years for Jehoshaphat, while 2 Kings reports 22. These figures are reconciled by suggesting a co-regency with his father, Asa, for 3 years, probably due to the severity of his father's illness, as well as in order to arrange for a secure succession. Kings speaks only of his years of sole reign after his father's death. And we encountered that in chapter 17 because it has that line, in his third year, he began the reformations, which many commentators took to be the first year of his solo reign. So that is going to end the reign of Jehoshaphat. But I do want to loop all the way back to the beginning of chapter 19. And I alluded to this language, and I wanted to return back here, and it's this language of wrath. Wrath has gone out against you from the Lord. Now, providentially, a video in my timeline popped up of everyone's favorite TikTok Mormon with terrible theology takes. He did a video on 2 Kings 3, and Inspiring Philosophy has a good video on his YouTube channel of this issue. There's some interesting theological themes, so I'd encourage you to check that out for a full treatment. But Williamson, among others, made an interesting observation about chapter 20 and this miraculous deliverance. In a bygone era, some scholars used to take chapter 20 as a literary invention based off of 2 Kings 3 to give this particular chapter more of a happy ending. The two chapters do have some vague similarities, but the differences are really big. Scholars have since taken that older view to task and have concluded there's no historical basis to link these two chapters. But this has led some, like Williamson, to see an overcorrection. The chronicler perhaps did have 2 Kings 3 in mind when he tells the story of 2 Chronicles chapter 20. But we'll need to look at 2 Kings to appreciate it. Once again, see people like Inspiring Philosophy for a fuller treatment. And I'll post a link to an important article on Ko-Fi or something. But to sum up our Kings passage, it tells the story of Jehoram, the king of Israel, who succeeded Ahab. And he joins forces with Jehoshaphat and the king of Edom to fight against the king of Moab, who has rebelled from Israel. But the allies face a water shortage during the campaign because of the route they take. So they seek the advice of Elisha, the prophet, and he only agrees to inquire of the Lord for them because of his respect for Jehoshaphat. But he prophesies and he assures them that water will flow into the valley, providing for both the army and their animals, and he also seemingly prophesies the army's victory. The next day, water fills the valley, and the Moabites in the distance, they mistake the water's reflection of the sun for blood, thinking the kings have turned against each other. And these kingdoms have been at war with each other in the past, so it's not unreasonable to think. But that, of course, is very similar to what we see in chapter 20 of Chronicles. So the Moabites come to plunder what they think is the aftermath of a battle, but instead they find the allied armies, and they're pushed back until we read in verse 26, when the king of Moab saw that the battle was going against him, he took with him 700 swordsmen to break through opposite the king of Edom, but they cannot. Now, if the account ended there, this would be a relatively straightforward narrative, but it doesn't. We have a final verse, and that throws a monkey wrench into everything. It reads, "Then he, the king of Moab, took his oldest son, who was to reign in his place, and offered him for a burnt offering on the wall. And there came great wrath against Israel, and they withdrew from him and returned to their own land." Now, this verse is superficially as vague as it is controversial. It's a favorite for skeptics and non-confessional scholars with an axe to grind, because they would argue the king makes a desperation burnt offering of his son to their patron deity, Chemosh, who then burns in wrath against Israel. And so the allied armies leave defeated because Chemosh defeats Yahweh in battle, and Elisha's prophecy fails, etc., etc. But there are so many problems with this interpretation. I'm surprised any scholars go in this direction at all. The first and very simple problem I have with this interpretation is, why would this story be in the Bible? Why record a story where a rival deity defeats yours? This interpretation invites and leaves unanswered this burning question. Another problem is the wrath language. Because the verse is so vague, some had tried to argue this was the king of Moab's wrath. But this language always speaks of divine wrath, so that doesn't work. But there's a big problem with arguing this divine wrath is coming from Chemosh. He's never mentioned in the passage. You have to assume that into the text. And maybe a bigger problem is the rest of the Hebrew Bible. Divine wrath is only ever tied to Yahweh. So for this argument to work, this rival deity defeating Yahweh and defeating the army of Israel, for that argument to work, you'd have to say this is the one passage in the Hebrew Bible where wrath is kindled by a rival deity, and it happens in a passage where no other deity is even mentioned. Right? It makes no sense. It makes far more sense that the divine wrath is coming from Yahweh, consistent with the rest of Scripture. But why would Yahweh be angered by Israel and seemingly nullify Elisha's prophecy of victory? Well, a very good case has been made. The king of Moab's sacrifice has been misunderstood. A scholar, Drew Holland, builds off of others and points out burnt offerings were made after battles, in victory as thanks to the deity, but in defeat as atonement for failure. This would, of course, be an example of the latter, a military failure. So verse 26 records the failed attempt to break through against the king of Edom. That was the defeat. The battle was over at that point. If so, the rest of the details in verse 27 become really important. Holland further argues this offering done on the wall, visibly in front of Israel, would have been done with Israel's approval, if not outright participation. Remember, this was the son of the king, the next in line to the throne. So in essence, this is the king admitting in defeat that he broke his treaty with Israel. So he offers his son, the heir to the throne, as atonement in his place, which apparently Israel accepts. So this means you have Israel in some level complicit with this human sacrifice. This is why Yahweh's wrath is burning against Israel, and he drives them from the land, and he takes away victory from them. I think this is how the chronicler understood the story, because twice in chapter 19 we're told about the wrath of Yahweh, and specifically the desire to avoid it. What Williamson argued is, while there's no historical link between 2 Kings 3 and 2 Chronicles 20, there's still a theological one, where in 2 Kings, Yahweh's wrath burned against Israel. In chapter 20 of our passage, Jehoshaphat does everything he can to avoid the wrath and judgment of God. And hooking back to chapter 18, a chapter chiastically linked with chapter 20, Yahweh confuses the enemies of his people. In chapter 18, Ahab and his false prophets. In chapter 20, a coalition of 3 armies. In both of our battle accounts here in Chronicles, the divine council participates in some way. With all that as a backdrop, we can look at what Williamson says, and I think can appreciate it now. He says, older commentators used to compare this account, the one in chapter 20, with 2 Kings 3, 4 through 27. More recent work has rightly shown that, after all, there is no direct literary or historical connection between them. The chronicler's source is to be sought elsewhere. Because of this, 2 Kings seems to have been ignored altogether in modern discussions. That too, however, is mistaken. Naturally, the chronicler will have known of it, and is going to say that they could have just adopted this material if they wanted to, but he says, why then does he appear to replace it with this quite separate account, which indeed has certain resemblances with 2 Kings 3, but which also has some fundamental differences? We would suggest that a clue lies in the concluding verse of that account in Kings. And there came great wrath upon Israel, and they withdrew from him and returned to their own land. The chronicler, however, as already noted, wishes to show how such wrath can be averted. He has therefore substituted another story in which this time Jehoshaphat acts without an alliance with Israel and in perfect dependence upon God. And on this occasion, the result is exactly the opposite. An outstanding triumph. So I think that this actually does further that argument that what you have in 2 Kings 3 is not Yahweh being defeated in battle. It's Israel participating illicitly back with their enemies, being involved in this illicit sacrifice, and being under the wrath of God. This chapter is kind of the antithesis of that, in that they do everything right this time. They resort to the Lord positively. But that is the reign of Jehoshaphat. And we will continue next time.